Teacher of Reddit, what's the most shocking late excuse that was surprisingly true? Story 1. As a teacher, I've heard every excuse in the book for being late, but one in particular stands out as both the most unbelievable and the most true. It was a rainy Tuesday morning, and my first period class had already begun. We were going over the day's lesson when one of my quietest, most reliable students burst into the room, soaking wet, covered in mud, and looking completely disheveled. The entire class went silent as we all turned to look at him. "Brennan," I asked, trying to keep the concern out of my voice. "What happened?" He stood there, dripping water onto the floor, and just let out a long sigh before saying, "I took a shortcut." Now, this was a student who was never late, always did his work, and never caused any trouble, so naturally I was curious and a bit worried. I asked him to explain, and it turns out that he had decided to take a shortcut through a field to avoid the heavy traffic that morning. Unfortunately, the field had turned into a mud pit from all the rain, and halfway through he slipped and fell into a particularly deep patch. He got stuck, and it took him a while to get free and drag himself the rest of the way to school. I looked at him, covered in mud from head to toe, his shoes squelching with every step, and I couldn't help but believe him. The evidence was literally dripping off of him. I sent him to the nurse to get cleaned up and asked the front office to call his parents for a change of clothes. When he came back, he was clean and dry, but still embarrassed. I'll tell you, in all my years of teaching, that's the only time I've excused someone for being late just because of how completely, undeniably true their story was. Story 2. I had a strict policy in my psychology class. No one could be late unless they had a really good excuse. I even told my students at the start of the term that the only acceptable reason for being late was if they were caught behind a funeral procession. Anything else, and they'd be marked tardy. A few weeks into the semester, I was setting up for class when I noticed one of my students knocking on the door a few minutes late. I was ready to remind him of my rule, but before I could say anything, he pulled out his phone and showed me a video. There, on the screen, was a long line of cars, lights flashing, moving slowly down the road. It was indeed a funeral procession. He looked at me with this sheepish grin and said, "I guess I made it in time." I was stunned. In all my years of teaching, I had never actually expected anyone to use that excuse, let alone have proof. But there it was, right in front of me. "Well, I'll be damned," I said, shaking my head with a smile. "Come on in." The whole class had a good laugh about it, and from that day on, I couldn't help but think that sometimes the most unlikely excuses can end up being the most true. Story 3. I've been teaching English for years, and every once in a while you get a student who has a truly wild story to tell, but this one I'll never forget. A student of mine, let's call him Mike, was one of those solid students. He always did his work, never missed a deadline, and generally kept his head down, so when he came to me one day, looking stressed and without his major term paper, I knew something had to be wrong. He told me that his house had been broken into and that the thieves had stolen a safe. Inside that safe was his laptop, which had the paper on it. I'll admit I was a bit skeptical at first, but then over the next few weeks, Mike started showing up to class looking more and more exhausted. He'd come in with dark circles under his eyes, clearly not sleeping well. When I asked him what was going on, he said that he and his cousin were spending their nights driving around the bad parts of town, looking for the guy who stole the safe. And here's the kicker. Mike and his cousin were both recently back from tours in Iraq. These were guys who had seen combat and weren't about to let some petty thief get away with their stuff. Mike told me they had a lead on the guy's van and they were determined to get back what was stolen. Over the next few weeks, he kept coming to class looking like he hadn't slept at all. But then, one day, he walked into my office with a huge grin on his face. They had found the guy. He said they tracked him down to a drug den and after a bit of persuasion with some baseball bats, managed to get the safe back. Not only did they recover the safe, but they also discovered that the thief had been using the stolen cash to buy counterfeiting equipment. The Secret Service even got involved. Mike apologized for the quality of the rewritten paper he had turned in. It was done in a rush while he was on the hunt for the thief. But at that moment, I didn't care. I gladly accepted the original paper, and honestly, I gave it a much higher grade than the rewrite. It's not every day that a student has to go on a vigilante mission to get their homework back, but in Mike's case, it was all true. I learned that sometimes even the craziest stories can have a basis in reality. Story 4. Back when I was teaching high school, I had a student who was part of the school's auto repair program. This kid, let's call him Jake, was always eager to learn and get his hands dirty, so I let him practice on my own car one day. We were working on tire rotations, and he seemed to be doing fine, though I made a mental note to double check his work later. The next morning, class had already started, and I noticed Jake wasn't in his seat. About 20 minutes into the period, the classroom door swung open, and Jake burst in, completely out of breath, his hair a mess. He didn't even bother sitting down. Instead, he pointed straight at me and said, "You, what's the torque wrench for?" I just stared at him, confused, and managed to say, for tightening the lug nuts on the tires." He nodded furiously and said, "Exactly, and guess who forgot to use it?" Turns out Jake had been driving to school when one of the tires we had worked on the day before came flying off on the highway. He had to pull over, chase down the tire, and try to put it back on, which is why he was so late. As much as I wanted to be mad at him for potentially wrecking my car, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the situation. We ended up spending the rest of the class talking about the importance of double checking your work, especially when it's something that could send a tire flying off at 60 miles per hour. Jake learned his lesson, and I learned to always check the work of an eager student. Story 5. 5 years ago, when I was teaching middle school, we had a small, close-knit community where everyone knew each other. One morning, 5 of my students showed up to class about 15 minutes late. They were all out of breath, their clothes were slightly disheveled, and they had these looks on their faces like they had just been through something wild. Naturally, I asked them why they were late. One of the kids, let's call him Tommy, blurts out, "The school bus blew up." I raised an eyebrow, not sure if he was exaggerating or just trying to cover up for being late. "The engine blew up?" I asked. "No, the whole bus went up in flames." Another student chimed in. Now, I've heard some pretty creative excuses in my time, but this one was a bit much. I was about to question them further when the door to my classroom opened and one of the administrators walked in. She had a printout in her hand from a local news website with a headline that read, "School bus catches fire on Route 14. Apparently, the bus had indeed caught fire on the way to school, and these kids were on it. They had to evacuate and wait for another bus to come pick them up, which is why they were late. The admin confirmed their story, and I just stood there, half amazed, half horrified. I gave the kids a pass, of course, but not before telling them, well, that's one excuse I'll never forget. After that, whenever those kids were late, they'd just give me a look and say, "No bus fire today, we promise."